this tutorial, we will be discussing one of the most deadly industrial accidents in U.S. history. The Second Industrial Revolution hit the United States in the second half of the 19th century. Companies and corporations were growing larger than ever before, using mass production techniques to manufacture massive quantities of goods. New inventions were revolutionizing the country every year. Telegraphs and phonographs made communication and entertainment easier. The Bessemer process created strong and cheap steel that could be used in skyscrapers, and interchangeable parts made the manufacturing of things like cars quicker and cheaper than ever before. However, even though industrialization brought benefits to many people, it also placed severe stresses on the environment and on low-income factory workers. The factories were often cramped, and workers toiled for long hours with little pay. Many factory owners were interested in ways to make the most profit, which in many cases meant cutting corners for the safety and pay of their workers. One extreme example that led to a disaster was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York City. This factory, as the name suggests, made clothing. As such, it was primarily staffed by young women who had recently immigrated to the United States. The factory owners enforced a rigid economy in the factory itself. Sewing machines were placed incredibly close together to maximize how many women could work on a single floor of the factory. Scraps of cloth and cuttings accumulated in boxes around the factory floor. Months would go by before these would be removed, creating a massive fire hazard. Several of the stairways and doors were kept locked during the day so that workers could not steal from the factory or take unapproved breaks. Managers were able to check the purses of the workers at these doors. There were few laws at the time that forced factory owners to pay attention to factory conditions or workplace safety. In fact, the women worked on average 52 hours a week, including working on Saturday. They worked for as little as $7 to $12 a week. If a worker ever pressed management for change, they could be easily replaced. The workers themselves had little to no power to enact reform for the better. In this environment, an atrocity occurred. On March 25, 1911, at the end of the workday, at approximately 4:40 p.m., a fire started in one of the scrap bins on the corner of the 8th floor. At the time, the newspapers suggested the fire had been started by one of the engines running the many sewing machines on the floor. Without fire alarms, it was difficult to spread the word between floors that a fire had started. Many of the workers on the 8th floor itself were able to escape, and a telephone allowed the 10th floor to be warned. However, the 9th floor only heard warnings of the fire as the fire itself spread to their workspaces. The flames blocked one of the main stairways. The others were locked, and the foreman who had the key had already escaped without unlocking them. Many of the women crammed out onto the fire escape, hoping to get away that way. However, the fire escape was poorly made, and the heat caused it to collapse, plunging nearly 24 workers to their deaths below. The elevator allowed some to escape, but eventually the heat threatened to buckle the elevator rails, and it could not offer any more assistance. When firefighters arrived, their ladders were not tall enough to reach the 9th floor. Many women who had made it to a window jumped for their lives, only to die as they hit the pavement. By the end of the ordeal, 146 people had died from either the fire, smoke inhalation, or jumping to their deaths. Many of these deaths would have been avoidable if only basic safety regulations had been put into place and followed. This tragic event galvanized public opinion behind a growing movement to reform conditions in the factories. The owners of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory were brought up on charges. Political cartoons at the time criticized the way that the factory had been run only for profit without regard for the workers' safety. Union leaders, politicians, and reformers pushed for change in factory conditions to protect the rights of the workers. Many of the fire and safety regulations today had their beginning in the reform movements following the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. These dangers were not just limited to clothing factories, but were present in all areas of manufacturing, industry, and mining in the United States. The Industrial Revolution turned the United States into an economic superpower. It brought countless new inventions and consumer goods into daily life. However, it was not a neat and clean process. The desire for profit and a disregard for workers' safety and the environment placed severe pressures on the lives of America's working classes. As tragedies exposed the failures of industrialization, many reform movements sought to preserve the good that industrialization had brought, while also addressing its failures and helping the people at the bottom who had been left behind. It's important to remember that our modern world has been built not just with ingenuity, entrepreneurship, and hard work, but also with pain, sweat, blood, and sacrifice. The next time you use a piece of modern technology, consider the history that made the use of that product possible.